Reasons medieval castles were freezing traps. Sleep history script. Picture this: you're a medieval lord sleeping in what looks like the ultimate fortress. But you wake up with your breath visible in the air and ice crystals forming on your blankets. Medieval castles weren't the cozy strongholds movies make them out to be. They were stone death traps that could literally freeze you to death in your sleep. When we think about medieval castles, we imagine grand halls with roaring fireplaces and warm, safe bedrooms. The reality was much darker and a lot colder. These massive stone fortresses were built for defense, not comfort, and during winter months they became almost uninhabitable ice boxes. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through the 5 main reasons why sleeping in a medieval castle during winter was basically a survival challenge that many people didn't win. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why even the richest nobles sometimes preferred sleeping in their stables rather than their own bedchambers. And there's one particular architectural feature that made castle winters so deadly that most people today have never even heard of it. Here's the thing most people don't realize about medieval castles. They were never designed with human comfort in mind. These structures were built with one primary goal: military defense. Every single design choice, from the thickness of the walls to the height of the ceilings, was made to keep enemies out, not to keep warmth in. The average medieval castle was essentially a giant stone refrigerator. Stone is an excellent material for defense because it's incredibly strong and fire-resistant. But stone also has terrible insulation properties. It absorbs cold from the outside and holds onto it like a massive frozen sponge. During summer months, this actually kept castles relatively cool, which was nice. But when winter arrived, those same stone walls became thermal vampires, sucking every bit of warmth out of the interior spaces. Think about the scale we're talking about here. Most castles had walls that were anywhere from 8 to 20 feet thick. These weren't just walls. They were solid stone barriers that went deep into the ground. The bigger the castle, the more stone mass there was to get cold and stay cold. And once several tons of stone reached freezing temperatures, it took enormous amounts of energy to warm them back up. The people living in these castles faced a constant battle against the cold that started in October and didn't end until April or May. Even wealthy nobles with access to the best heating technology of the time struggled to maintain any kind of comfortable temperature in their living spaces. For servants and lower-ranking household members, winter in a castle was often a matter of basic survival. But the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was genuinely dangerous. Medieval medical understanding was limited, and people didn't fully grasp the connection between cold exposure and illness. Many castle inhabitants developed what we would now recognize as hypothermia-related conditions. Respiratory infections from constantly breathing cold air, and various ailments from sleeping in near-freezing temperatures night after night. The challenge wasn't just staying warm during the day when you could move around and stay active. The real problem was surviving the long winter nights when temperatures dropped even further, and you had to somehow get enough sleep to function the next day. This is where the design flaws of medieval castles became truly life-threatening. But before we explore those deadly architectural features, let me tell you about the first major reason why castle winters were so brutal. The fundamental problem with medieval castles started with their basic building material. Stone might have been perfect for withstanding siege warfare, but it was absolutely terrible for creating a livable environment during cold weather. Medieval builders used primarily limestone, sandstone, and granite for castle construction. These materials were chosen because they were locally available, incredibly durable, and could be shaped into massive blocks that would last for centuries. What the builders didn't account for was the thermal properties of these stones. Stone has what engineers call high thermal mass, which means it can absorb and store large amounts of heat or cold. During winter, the massive stone walls of a castle would absorb cold from the outside air, especially during the long, freezing nights. Once the stone became cold, it acted like a giant heat sink, continuously drawing warmth out of the interior spaces. The walls weren't the only problem. Castle floors were typically made of stone as well, often just flat slabs laid directly on the ground or on a foundation of smaller stones. There was no insulation layer, no air gap, nothing to prevent the frozen ground from conducting cold directly up through the floor and into the living spaces. Walking barefoot on a castle floor in winter was like stepping on ice. Even the ceilings contributed to the problem. Many castle rooms had stone vaulted ceilings that created beautiful architectural features, but also provided enormous surface area for heat loss. Warm air would rise up to these stone ceilings, get cooled down by contact with the cold stone, and then fall back down as cold air, creating constant convection currents that made it nearly impossible to maintain any kind of stable temperature. The thickness of castle walls, which was supposed to be a defensive advantage, made the heating problem even worse. A typical castle wall might be 15 feet thick at the base. That represents an enormous amount of stone that needed to be warmed up before the interior could become comfortable. Even with multiple fires burning constantly, the heat would get absorbed into this mass of cold stone before it could significantly warm the living spaces. Medieval castle builders did try some techniques to address the cold, but their solutions were limited by the technology and materials available to them. Some castles had double walls with an air gap in between, which provided slightly better insulation. Others used thick tapestries and wall hangings to create a barrier between the occupants and the cold stone surfaces. But these measures could only do so much against the fundamental thermal problems created by solid stone construction. The stone construction problem was made even worse by medieval building techniques. The mortar used to hold stone blocks together was often made from lime, sand, and water. This mortar was porous and allowed cold air to seep through the joints between stones. Over time, as the mortar aged and developed cracks, these air leaks became even more significant, creating drafts that made interior spaces feel even colder. But stone construction was just the beginning of the problems. The way these massive stone structures were designed created even more serious issues for anyone trying to stay warm during the winter months. And there's one particular design feature that turned castle bedrooms into deadly cold traps. Reason 2: window and door design. Medieval castle windows were designed as defensive features first and sources of light and air second. Comfort wasn't even a consideration, and this created serious problems when winter temperatures dropped below freezing. Most castle windows were nothing more than narrow slits in the stone walls, called arrow loops or murder holes. These openings were designed to allow defenders to shoot arrows or crossbow bolts at attackers while providing minimal target area for return fire. They were typically only a few inches wide on the outside but expanded to larger openings on the inside to give archers room to aim. The problem with these narrow windows was that they couldn't be effectively sealed against cold weather. Medieval glass was expensive and fragile, so most castle windows had no glass at all. Instead, they might be covered with thin sheets of horn, oiled cloth, or wooden shutters. None of these materials provided anything close to an airtight seal. Even in the larger windows found in great halls and noble bedchambers, the glass was often just small panes held together with lead strips. The glass itself was thick and uneven, full of bubbles and imperfections that created weak points. More importantly, the lead joining system left gaps that allowed cold air to flow freely into the castle interior. Wooden shutters were common, but they rarely fit tightly against the stone window openings. Medieval carpentry was skilled but limited by the tools available, and creating perfectly fitted wooden closures for irregularly shaped stone openings was extremely difficult. Even the best-fitted shutters left gaps that allowed drafts to penetrate into the interior spaces. The doors presented even bigger problems. Medieval castle doors needed to be strong enough to withstand attacks, so they were typically made of thick oak planks reinforced with iron bands. But strength and insulation are different properties, and these heavy doors were terrible at keeping cold air out. Most castle doors hung on simple iron hinges that left significant gaps around the edges. The door frames were usually just carved recesses in the stone walls, and achieving a tight seal between wood and stone was nearly impossible with medieval construction techniques. Cold air would flow around the edges of doors, under them, and through any gaps in the construction. Interior doors were often even worse for insulation purposes. Many castle rooms were separated by nothing more than heavy curtains or tapestries. While these fabric barriers could block some drafts, they provided minimal insulation value and allowed cold air to move freely between different areas of the castle. The entrance doors to castles were particularly problematic. These massive portals needed to be opened frequently for people, supplies, and animals to enter and exit. Every time a door was opened during winter, huge volumes of cold outside air would rush into the castle interior, instantly dropping the temperature in nearby spaces. Many castles had multiple layers of doors and gates, which should have provided better insulation, but these systems were rarely coordinated for thermal efficiency. You might have a heavy outer door, a portcullis, and an inner door, but if they weren't all closed at the same time, the cold air could still penetrate deep into the castle structure. The design of doorways themselves created additional problems. Medieval doors often opened directly into main living areas without any kind of airlock or transitional space. Modern buildings use entryways and vestibules to prevent cold air from flowing directly into heated spaces, but medieval castles typically had doors that opened straight from the outside into great halls or other important rooms. But even if every window and door in a castle could have been perfectly sealed, there was still another major design problem that made these structures nearly impossible to heat effectively, and this problem was literally built into the architecture. Reason 3: massive interior spaces. Medieval castles were built with enormous interior spaces that were absolutely impossible to heat effectively with the technology available at the time. These grand halls and soaring chambers might have looked impressive, but they were thermal disasters that made winter survival extremely difficult. The Great Hall was typically the centerpiece of any medieval castle, and these spaces were designed to demonstrate the power and wealth of the lord who owned the castle. A typical Great Hall might be 60 to 80 feet long, 30 to 40 feet wide, and have ceilings that soared 30 or 40 feet above the floor. That represents an enormous volume of air that needed to be heated. Think about the mathematics of heating such a space. Modern heating engineers use calculations based on cubic feet of air volume to determine heating requirements. A medieval Great Hall might contain anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 cubic feet of air. Even with modern heating systems, warming that much air would be expensive and challenging. With medieval heating technology, it was nearly impossible. The high ceilings that made these halls look so grand created a serious problem called thermal stratification. Warm air is less dense than cold air, so it naturally rises toward the ceiling. In a room with a 40-foot ceiling, the warm air from fires and body heat would rise up and get trapped near the top of the room, leaving the lower areas where people actually lived and worked much colder. Medieval people understood this problem to some degree, which is why many great halls had galleries or upper levels where the lord and important guests could sit. These elevated areas were slightly warmer because they were closer to where the warm air accumulated. But even these spaces were still much colder than what we would consider comfortable today. The stone construction made the thermal stratification problem even worse. The high stone walls and ceilings would absorb heat from the warm air that rose to the top of the room, cooling that air and causing it to fall back down. This created constant circulation patterns that prevented any stable warm zones from developing. Beyond the great halls, medieval castles typically included many other large spaces that were equally difficult to heat. Bedchambers for nobles were often surprisingly large, designed more for ceremony and displaying wealth than for comfort. Even a modest noble's bedroom might be 20 feet by 30 feet with 15-foot ceilings, representing thousands of cubic feet of air that needed to be warmed. Stairways and corridors presented their own heating challenges. Medieval castles often had long stone corridors connecting different areas, and these spaces acted like cold air highways, allowing frigid air to flow freely throughout the structure. Spiral staircases, which were common in castle towers, created chimney effects that drew cold air up from lower levels and distributed it throughout the castle. The kitchens, which generated significant heat from cooking fires, were often located far from the main living areas for fire safety reasons. This meant that one of the main sources of heat in the castle couldn't effectively warm the spaces where people spent most of their time. Heat generated in the kitchen would be lost long before it could reach bedchambers or private rooms. Storage areas, which took up significant portions of most castles, were typically unheated entirely. These cold zones acted like thermal sinks, absorbing any warm air that might flow into them and contributing to the overall cooling of the castle structure. Some castle designers tried to address the heating problems by creating smaller, more private chambers within the larger structure. These solar rooms or private apartments were more manageable in size, but they were still built with stone walls and often had high ceilings that made heating difficult. But even the most well-designed small chambers in medieval castles suffered from a heating problem that was literally built into the walls, a feature that most people today have never heard of, but which made castle winters deadly. Here's the moment that really drives home how deadly these castle heating problems could be. There's a documented case from 1348 where the entire household of Dunstafnage Castle in Scotland nearly died during a particularly harsh winter because their heating systems failed completely. The castle had multiple fireplaces and adequate fuel supplies, but a combination of factors created a perfect storm of heating failure. Heavy snow blocked the chimney openings, preventing proper ventilation and filling the rooms with smoke. The inhabitants were forced to let their fires go out to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. With no heat source at all, the massive stone structure became a giant icebox. The stone walls, which had absorbed cold throughout weeks of winter weather, continued radiating cold even after the outside temperatures began to rise slightly. The thermal mass that made castles so hard to heat also made them impossible to warm up quickly once they got truly cold. Within 3 days, ice was forming on the interior walls of the castle. The bread in storage froze solid. Wine turned to slush. People's breath was visible indoors, and several members of the household developed what medieval records describe as the cold sickness, probably hypothermia and respiratory infections caused by breathing freezing air. The household survived only because they abandoned most of the castle and crowded together in the smallest room they could find, using body heat and sharing whatever warm clothing and blankets they had. Even then, 2 servants died from cold-related illnesses, and several others suffered frostbite damage to their fingers and toes. This wasn't an isolated incident. Medieval records from across Europe contain references to similar cold-related deaths in castles during harsh winters. The very structures that were supposed to protect their inhabitants from external threats often became death traps when the weather turned severe. What makes this even more tragic is that the technology to solve most of these heating problems already existed in other parts of the world. Roman hypocaust heating systems could have warmed castle interiors effectively, but this technology was largely forgotten in medieval Europe. Asian heating methods using heated floors and thermal mass storage could have made castle winters survivable, but these techniques weren't known to European builders. The irony is that medieval castles represented some of the most advanced architectural and engineering knowledge of their time, but they were designed with no consideration for basic human thermal comfort. These incredible structures that took decades to build and cost enormous sums of money were essentially uninhabitable for several months of every year. So there you have it, The 5 main reasons why sleeping in a medieval castle during winter was basically a survival challenge that many people didn't survive. The solid stone construction created massive thermal mass that absorbed and held cold temperatures. Windows and doors were designed for defense, not insulation, allowing drafts to flow freely throughout the interior. Enormous room volumes were impossible to heat with medieval technology. Primitive heating systems were inefficient and often dangerous. And thermal bridges combined with massive air leakage made it nearly impossible to maintain any kind of comfortable interior temperature. Medieval castle inhabitants dealt with these problems through layers of clothing, sharing beds for warmth, and often simply accepting that winter meant several months of being cold and uncomfortable. Wealthy nobles might have had slightly better heating in their private chambers, but even they suffered through castle winters that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards. The next time you see a medieval castle in a movie with people walking around in light clothing and everyone looking comfortable, remember that the reality was very different. These magnificent structures were architectural marvels that could withstand siege warfare and last for centuries. But they were terrible places to try to stay warm during the long, cold winter months. Understanding these heating challenges helps us appreciate both the incredible resilience of medieval people and the advances in building technology that make our modern lives comfortable. We've solved problems that made life genuinely difficult for even the wealthiest people of previous eras. Sleep well tonight in your warm, well-insulated modern home, and maybe spare a thought for all those medieval castle dwellers who spent their winter nights shivering under piles of wool blankets, hoping to make it through until spring. Subscribe for more cozy historical bedtime stories that'll make you grateful for modern heating.